the Supreme Court has made a similar decision that a life sentence without the possibility of parole for a minor is not constitutional, right? It's an unjust punishment. And so they're almost there, right? But you know, we often think, like, when we think about draconian drug laws, we think about the Philippines, we think about these like East Asian countries where we're getting these headlines of all these Australians who maybe smuggled a kilo and now they're facing a death sentence, right? People don't know that, and I may be incorrect, but I remember having this conversation with a group of United States attorneys. The death penalty is available in certain drug offenses in the United States federally. That is something that I, in full honesty, I never looked into, but I was told by my fellow colleagues. And I remember being the only attorney, the only U.S. attorney at the table that said, does anybody else have a problem with that? Like, death sentence is available. That was news to me because I was a young U.S. attorney at the time.
To play devil's advocate, couldn't you imagine a scenario where there were, say, adulterated drugs? Maybe fentanyl wasn't something it shouldn't be in, caused the deaths of a lot of people.
You're talking about an aggravated circumstance.
Right.
Right? You're talking about an instance where somebody suffers serious bodily injury or death. Now, I can think of a circumstance where an individual brings fentanyl in and then deals fentanyl to a bunch of people, and then 20 people die from adulterated drugs that they played off as ecstasy or whatever like that. Somebody died. Let's talk about the aggravating factor in that circumstance. But when you're talking about a street level organization that's dealing a lot of drugs where we have no deaths, I mean, can you ever get in your mind to the point where somebody should be killed, right? No. Or should somebody serve a life sentence without the possibility of parole? That's too hard for me, in my opinion. As a former federal prosecutor, and it's easy, I think, for people that have not been in that situation, that have not been in my position, to where you're the one making the argument to the federal judge that this individual should not see the light of day for the rest of their life. You would, regardless of your opinion, you would think differently. It doesn't matter if you're a mom whose child overdosed or anything like that. If you're in the position to call the shot that somebody has to go away for 99 years, you will go home and cry. I'll tell you this, my first murder case that I ever tried as a prosecutor, I was invited to be what's called co-counsel. And at the time, it was a individual who was driving a car who was accused of aiding and abetting in a murder, right? He allegedly drove up and an individual came out, a drug addict came out. It was a known drug addict in the community of Laredo, came out and talked to his backseat passenger, and the backseat passenger, and this is disputed, right? It all comes down to knowledge. Did this individual that was driving know that the backseat passenger was armed and intended to commit murder? The backseat passenger eventually, over a drug debt, pulled out a gun and killed the drug addict that came to the window. They drove away and we had a trial. And the issue was, did the driver know that that individual in the backseat was gonna commit murder? Unless you had a machine, which doesn't exist, you would never know what was in that individual's head, right? And this was my first murder. I, as a prosecutor, had to struggle with, this individual's murder is a first-degree felony, punishable by 5 to 99 years. 99 is what we call life in Texas. And I had to struggle with, did this individual know? Did he knowingly aid and abet in the murder by driving the vehicle to this drug dealer's house, right, or drug addict's house? And I struggled with that throughout the trial. It was my first murder, and I never thought that I would be in this position where, as a prosecutor, I was saying, am I potentially convicting an innocent person, right? So we eventually secured a guilty verdict. And when I went home, everybody was celebrating, but when I went home, it was my first murder case. I cried my eyes out, right? I cried my eyes out because I struggled with whether or not this individual knew, right? How would we ever know, right? All the evidence was circumstantial. He picked up the individual that had the gun. He drove them to the house. He, after the crime was committed, fled. absconded, right? They hid the weapon. There was all this circumstantial evidence that this individual may have been involved, aided and abetted in the crime. Do we know for certain that he knew that this person in the backseat was going to kill the individual? Is there any way to know for certain that was in his mind? No. And I struggle with that, that's...
What do you think about the case, it was in Georgia recently, where the father and the son basically tried to, do a citizen's arrest on someone that they thought had been trespassing. Mm-hmm. Now, the father and the son both got life without the possibility of parole. Yeah. And their buddy, who basically helped to cut the guy off in his vehicle, but obviously didn't know necessarily what was going to follow, got life with the possibility of parole. Would that kind of case give you pause? Like, how would you look at that?
I think the jury verdict there was correct. I followed that case, and from what I saw, again, I wasn't a juror, I wasn't a prosecutor, I wasn't the defense attorney, but from what I saw, I was convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that that the jury verdict was correct in that case. We can get into a very detailed discussion about Georgia's stand your ground law or the vigilante arrest. I don't know what it's called.
Citizen's arrest.
Citizen's arrest kind of thing. I mean, we can really get into the depths of that. But like when you view it from a common sense standpoint, I do think that the jury came to the correct verdict. Yeah. I mean, that was an individual who, according to what I've seen, was, whether or not he was on a jog or not, right? Whether he was on a jog or committing potential felony by trespassing or burglary of a hab or whatever you want to call it, I think that those individuals were motivated by, for me, in what I saw, it was clear that those individuals were motivated by something besides effectuating an arrest, right? I mean, there was so many other factors.